They say being a parent is a full-time job, but I already have one of those. Luckily, I use Instacart to help me order everything I need while I'm stuck in meetings all day. So while Instacart is helping me get groceries, snacks for school lunches, and something for at-home happy hour, I get more time back to juggle my day job and my mom job. Save time by downloading the Instacart app or visit instacart.com to get $20 off your first order using the code INGREDIENTS20. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum order $35. Delivery subject to availability. Additional terms apply.
Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance to go watch Made in China. We play.
So hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm here today with Jonathan Woetzel, McKinsey's MGI director and a senior partner in the Shanghai office. He leads research on China, Asia, and global economic and business trends. What his work does helps cities and regions create sustainable growth and supports the transformation of Chinese companies into global leaders. Today, we're here to talk about his recent report titled Chinese Digital Economy. First, Jonathan, thanks so much and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jordan.
So before we jump into this topic, if we could just get a little bit of your China story. So what first brought you here and kept you in the Middle Kingdom?
Opportunity for both. That back in the 80s, China was a strange foreign place for people outside of China. No one had been there for 30 years, and it was unclear what the opportunities might be. For personal reasons, had always been interested in China. My father was actually born in Shanghai, and so I grew up speaking some Chinese and knowing something about the culture. In school, I started to learn more about China, and once I got to know it a bit, I realized there was a massive opportunity. So I came and was part of my firm's initial setup, and never found a reason to leave, as the opportunities just kept getting bigger and bigger.
So if you could just sort of very quickly generalize how your experience working with Chinese firms has changed over time.
Well, initially we didn't really work with Chinese firms because there really weren't any Chinese firms.
Sure.
The whole concept of management is relatively new to China. 35, 40 years ago, there weren't such things as companies. You had assets, but you didn't really have management. So what's obviously happened over the last 40 years is China has kind of got the concept of management and business and enterprise. Now the majority of our work is with private Chinese enterprises who are facing many of the similar challenges as their counterparts anywhere in the world. But perhaps their context is very Chinese.
It must have been a remarkable arc to get to see firsthand.
Yeah, it was. It's been a great ride because essentially it's been the story of how hundreds of millions of people have sort of jumped into the sea and sort of figured out how to become entrepreneurial, how to help themselves become richer, and with that, the economy and the society has become much more complex and more interesting.
Sure. Are there any particular years you thought over this career you've had in China that really stuck out to you as important or meaningful or represented future changes to come?
1991.
Sure.
Mostly because it was 2 years after 1989, and it took about a year or two for business to recover from what was this initial shock about China went through its first post-reform cycle, coincident with Tiananmen, and so 2 years later, business came back. So it was sort of a vote of confidence, if you will, for the Chinese economy and the reform process. So that was a pretty big year, all things considered. And then, of course, there have been other big years along the way. Notably, China's gone through at least two of those cycles. There was that one, and there was the one following it with SOE adjustments and reform. And again, another transition and another vote of confidence in the early 2000s in the Chinese economy.
Sure.
So China has its cycles.
And we may be seeing one now. Coming to your report, the first part of it focuses a lot on innovation. The narrative in the West that China has nothing to contribute in terms of new technology and new business models has sort of fallen by the wayside. But if you could just talk about briefly the state of play and the most interesting players you think pushing Chinese innovation today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to start by defining our terms and what do we mean by innovation. And so for us, it's a change in a product or service that creates commercial value.
Sure.
So it's not invention per se, because that without commercial value is not particularly meaningful, nor is it, of course, just copying. So it's something else that we've actually done differently. And we think that there are at least 4 different kinds of innovation. There's consumer innovation, where you're changing something to respond to the marketplace. There's process innovation, where you change something in the factory. There's engineering innovation, which is about your supply chain and working together with different players. And of course, there's research innovation, where you're doing something in a lab and you ultimately take it forward into the marketplace. In each of those, China has a profile, and I think we can say that China's strongest at consumer innovation and process innovation. It has a mixed record in engineering innovation, and it's just getting started in research innovation. But in each of these, there are promising examples of companies that have really made a difference in areas where you would say China can potentially be a world leader.
Sure. So 1/3 of the world's global unicorns, one of the largest VC, there's a shocking amount of VC money being spent in Beijing and around the rest of the country. It really is remarkable what this economy's been up to over the past 10 years. Yeah,
of course. And I think that comes with, first of all, China basically represents a massive demand side shock to the world economy. Trillions of dollars of the savings of the Chinese people generated out of productivity growth that's been double digit for the last 30 years. Now all of a sudden the world's waking up to this new factor that creates, massive shifts in revenue pools across industries, as well as innovation and development of new industries. So maybe the digital story for China is sort of the logical outcome of what has been a very rapid catch-up along multiple disciplines and dimensions, financial, industrial, and academic and educational. So all of these dimensions, China's been progressing at double-digit rates from a relatively low base. But now when China shows up, of course, then it's a big deal. Sure.
So what would you say to those who would say that the only reason China has been able to create these giant companies is because they've basically locked out the Western competitors who are actually more productive and more innovative?
I think that there's a certain amount of truth to the fact that there are barriers. I mean, clearly that there are some industries and some segments where there's limits on competition. What China has going for it is that it has such a robust, large domestic market, is that domestic competition is often the thing that drives the innovation. We usually say it takes 2 Chinese players to make a price war, so that there's intense competition at every step of every value chain. And in many of these cases, when you look at it, the Chinese versus foreign competitor, the regulatory barrier came in, but actually the game was over before that.
Sure.
So that, I think there's, and finally, it was ever thus. It's very difficult to find a market in the world where you don't have regulatory barriers to competition.
Sure. My favorite analogy is one of Santi you hear every once in a while, the 3-body problem, where people talk about the China startup scene as a black forest or as a dark forest in which the competition is so fierce that you always have to be scared of being noticed because one of the BATs we'll come to in a second will just zap and wipe you off the face of the earth unless they find you worthy of investment. Mm-hmm. So, coming to BATs, if you could walk us quickly through the three dominant players in the tech world over the past 10 years, and whether or not you think, or let's just do that. So, if you could introduce to our audience BAT.
Well, I'm not going to be able to talk about the companies specifically, but what I can say are a couple of things. First of all, that this, and we really should say BATJ at this point,
sure,
is an ecosystem that is, unprecedentedly influential in its digital space. I mean, back in the 90s or the 2000s, I think the BAT was about 5% of venture capital funding in China, similar to the role that FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, had in the U.S. 10 years later, BAT is now 30 or 40% of the venture capital funding in China, and FANG is still back down in the 5 or 6% range.
Sure.
So clearly, this group of companies is now having a massive influence, and even more impressively, of course, is if you look at the top 50 startups, a good 40% of them are either directly funded, invested in, or run by alumni of BAT. So,
could you talk a little bit about the opportunities and the drawbacks of having such dominant players in the market?
Well, yeah, it's a real question of what do we mean by dominant? Because at the same time, venture capital funding has gone from $2 trillion to $2 billion, some up to $30 billion. I think it's probably, I'm off by a couple of zeros in there.
Sure.
So, I mean, it's obviously been an explosion of funding here and no shortage of startups. I mean, it's 1/3 of the world's unicorns. So their influence has been essentially to create platforms that these other startups are using. Now, of course, they extract their rent for access to those platforms.
Sure.
But they're nonetheless a way of saying instantly, well, if you have a better mousetrap, I will introduce it to 100 million people. And that's not something that any other ecosystem can do. So they have a unique capacity to get market access and get market data, and to use that data to help people monetize their new development or app that much faster.
So one of the big opportunities for Chinese startups and these venture firms, as opposed to more developed economies, is the almost shocking not shocking inefficiencies, but the large inefficiencies that are still around in such a giant economy. So if you could speak a little bit to that and how these companies are looking at fixing these problems for consumers and businesses.
Right. Well, as anybody who has spent any time in a Chinese bank, travel agency, department store, I can attest. I mean, things could be better.
Sure.
The productivity is relatively low, service is relatively poor. So, in that context, online represents an extremely viable and attractive alternative. As a result, you have this double-digit growth and 40% of the world's e-commerce and so forth, 11x the U.S.'s version of mobile payments. So all of that is to say, online grows to some extent because offline is so horrible. But that said, what we're really seeing, as our friends at Ali would say, and I can say this, is a omni-channel or a unichannel where there is a seamless blending of online and offline because everybody uses both. There's very few people who live a purely online world or at this stage a purely offline world. That there's an interconnect of these things. So essentially, digital allows us to make better choices and it also allows us to deliver better products and services. And any company which doesn't have a digital capacity, when it's not a digital strategy, it's just an integration of digital, is at a competitive disadvantage.
Could you talk just on a personal note about which headaches you think have been alleviated for you living in China over these years and which still bug you and are waiting for good solutions? I
think obviously share bikes and, the whole QR codes have been an enormous revolution. It's just payment mechanism. And so that has enabled QR codes enabling things like share bikes.
Sure.
It makes exercise possible.
Sure.
In a way which it might not have been otherwise. And so you would like to have the 10 or 15 minutes a day to sit down and cycle and sort of see the world in a different way. And, that's been enabled by technology. And now, still finding a decent dry cleaner, that appears to be a bottleneck that I haven't been able to solve yet. So I'm looking forward to the sharing economy kind of getting to that point.
All right. Well, all those potential startup founders out there, listen in. So another thing you focus on in this piece is the role of the government. You talk about how it is, like it's benevolent in action, whether that's designed or just given that a bureaucracy as large as China moves slowly, as well as its as well as the almost shocking amount of investment it's putting into a number of these fields. So first, maybe if you could talk about the regulatory impact or lack thereof that the government has shown in these sectors.
Well, I think there's two things going on here. One is the government has a keen appreciation for the role of the consumer going forward, and I think that battle has been well and truly won in the mind of the government. That the driving force of the economy will be the consumer, and so we need to support the consumer. So anything the consumer wants, the government is not likely to stand in the consumer's way. And as a result, digital, which has been something that again has been delivering something the consumer wants, has been given a pretty free rein.
Sure.
So it took 10 or 11 years before online banking became regulated as banking. That's an example. And there are many other examples of products and services, for example, e-hailing. This was not completely unregulated. And same for the share bikes. And so it only gets regulated at the point where the consumer starts to complain about something.
Yeah.
Whether it's surge pricing or some fraud or something like that. Mm-hmm. Then the government will step in. It won't actually regulate the service, but it will regulate the consequence and say, what is the problem?
We'll see what happens with kindergartens in the next year or two.
Well, kindergartens got regulated after a while because of safety and security. That was mainly it. So when people were starting to worry about physical issues. So it was the food that was being served and it was the quality of the playground equipment. That was the stuff that got regulated, not actually your ability to open a school or not.
Sure.
I think that we're going to see a and more complexity and and more capacity from the regulator to do stuff. We've called it benign neglect. Other people might say watchful waiting. Essentially, they're willing to see the product or service in the marketplace and then, adapt to, to figure out what's the appropriate level of intervention or license to inspect it.
Sure. And now turning to the government spending in these fields, pushing, to have China be an AI leader or a solar leader. Is this wasteful? Is it useful? Does it matter if it's wasteful?
Well, as always, the Chinese government is pretty good at setting out the goalposts and saying this is where we want to go with this. But then if you peel the onion and sort of see how much money is associated with, surprisingly little. The Chinese government spending is relatively modest on these types of projects. Now, there are two kinds of government projects. There are the government projects that get driven by government directly through national entities like Strong Smart Grid or High Speed Rail. And I think those are things that almost are set up to pay for themselves through these utilities, the State Grid or this rail corporation. And then there are the projects which they basically say, well, we'd like to get there, and we encourage all of you guys down at the provincial and local level to support that. And then you get lots of provinces and cities kind of going out there and sort of trying to look good and sort of spend money on accelerators or automate some piece of their government equipment. End of the day, all of that sort of is in this is incremental capital spend at a local level, which essentially is not that much.
Sure.
What this does do is sort of help people figure out what's the government wants to have happen, and from the private sector's point of view, then they try to figure out how they're going to make that happen.
Yeah.
As they believe, and rightfully so, that there are ways the government can incentivize them if they come up with a commercially viable scheme.
Yeah.
The financial incentives are typically done at the local level, everything from free land to a little bit of support on your loans to access to talent, and all these things can and are done at the local level for both, I should say, local and foreign companies.
Sure. So turning now to the global impact of these firms, we see more and more Chinese companies expanding abroad, from Mobike to DJI to Alibaba's been at this game for a long time now. So I'm curious what you think in particular these companies are, just to generalize, are strong at, and what challenges will they face going forward in terms of localizing their products and understanding different markets.
Well, I'd say the number one thing they're strong at is they're willing to try. They're very entrepreneurial. And that contrasts perhaps to previous generations of globalizers from Korea or Japan, which perhaps also because their context was different. Back then, you didn't have so many opportunities to buy things. There wasn't really a private equity industry. There were more barriers, and there weren't as many targets. So current Chinese enterprises are more willing to acquire. They're more willing to try to go on their own, to do something in parallel, both organic and inorganic. But that's their, I think, competitive advantage in many cases. Beyond that, Chinese companies have grown up in China, so they have this feel for an emerging market requirement. So if you go look at Africa or the Middle East or even India, you start to see products and services in a business model which is fit for purpose more for an emerging market context, and particularly an emerging market urban consumer context. Beyond that, I think they're climbing the ladder of value added like every other country has in the past. And so Japan used to be, the cheap products that break quickly, and so it becomes the hallmark of quality. Chinese companies need to go down that path as well.
Sure.
Some of them are earlier than others. I would say if you look at the textile sector, for example, you'll see that, really high value products coming out of China right now, and low value products being outsourced to Bangladesh and Cambodia.
So overall, this is a very optimistic thesis. I'm curious if you could walk us through some potential risks that may, hamper Chinese firms taking over the world.
Well, I don't think they're going to take over the world.
Or hamper the innovation, hamper the continued expansion and development.
I think this is, in many ways, I would argue China's done the hard bit. The hard bit is to do double-digit growth for 30 years.
Sure.
Not too many economies have done that. And that's partly because of starting point. It's a really low starting point. But there are not too many economies have gotten their act together at such a low starting point to sustain 30 years of growth either.
Sure. Typically
people fail. So that now it's about sustaining and rejuvenating and renewing the model. And innovation is what you do once you have the capacity to do it. And basically, you need three things to do innovation. You need market, you need companies, you need regulators. Who are a system, if you will.
Sure.
So China has a market, China has the companies, China has a system. And so the simple fact is China's going to spend more on innovation than any other country in the world. the way in which it innovates is not so bad. You maybe say some strengths and weaknesses. And it's going to be global innovation. As you go to any research lab in China, you will find people who have been educated everywhere in the world.
Sure.
If they don't come, even if, it may come from other places in the world. So it's a uniquely global environment. So all that says to me is that, yeah, why wouldn't you expect this? This would just be natural. It's sort of a consequence or an outcome. So either you buy the Chinese economy growing, in which case you buy Chinese innovation, or you think it's going to fail. And so your bet on innovation is really just a bet on the Chinese economy and its ability to sustain growth.
Sure. So it's a more macro question in the end, because as long as the macro factors are working out, then these companies are going to keep doing what they've already proven themselves able to do.
Technology and innovation follows market.
Sure.
And yeah, I don't think it's going to be a uniformly successful model. I think we should expect to see a number of flameouts. I can say blue go-go because it just failed.
Sure.
But sure. I mean, as I said, it takes two Chinese companies to make a price war, and when you get 100% overcapacity, you're going to see some failures. But that's called capitalism.
Sure. Awesome. Well, thanks for that. So before we wrap up, if you could just maybe recommend 2 books for folks interested in this topic, and then one about anything related to China, or one topic that you think has not been properly covered, given the appropriate book length treatment.
Wow. Well, I mean, there's too many things to recommend. I've puzzled, but I would say, read MGI. I mean, seriously, McKinsey Global Institute. It's got probably the best sort of set of commercially available think tank reports. But if you want a book, then I really, my favorite author is Jonathan Spence.
Sure.
As a historian of China, so someone who has the view of centuries around what's happened in China. I like everything he's ever written, from The Question of Who to Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci.
Absolutely.
As far as a book that hasn't been written and that should be, I think there is a story to be told about Chinese innovation and the challenges of reintegrating into Chinese society. And how people who come back from outside get to be inside, and what really drove that. Sort of how did they experience their initial rejections? What drove them to go outside? How did they think that was even possible to make a round trip?
Sure.
Did they think it was possible? Was it all happenstance? I think that would give a lot of encouragement to many people in China to show the diversity of paths.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you so much for this.
My pleasure. Thanks, Ben.
我要从南走到北，我还要从北走到黑。我要人们都看到我，但不知道我是谁。